Kevin Flanagan from Brehon Academy. So look, thank you very much for joining us, Kevin. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Kevin's YouTube website are brehonacademy.org, and that's the go-to site regarding information regarding Brehon law, the Irish language, history and mythologies. So look, I've invited Kevin to join us because some of us are preparing for Frinwell Games this year. So like the Teletown Games, we're going to be continuing on the tradition of ancient warrior games held here for more than 3,000 years in era. So central to these games were the Brehon and the bardic skills and the knowledge and history and mythology, lawmaking and recitation of tales and poetry. So look, Kevin, tell us, what would the warriors have to be able to recite for the Frinwell Games, and how would they expect to be tested?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, Josie. I'm delighted to be here. And I had a big smile on my face when you said Brehon Academy is the go-to site. I'm glad you think so. I hope it is for other people as well. I set that up in 2013 specifically to bring awareness to some of the gaps that we have about our culture and our identity. And a large part of that I focused on, I guess if I want to call it my niche, is being on the Brehon Law. But I think it's kind of impossible to talk about the Brehon Law without talking about the whole culture and the society that went around it. And one of the very interesting things that is apparent when you first look into the Brehon Law is the way that they very carefully ordered society by different professions and different grades. That's just why we know that we had people like Brehons, for example, the judges. We had Fili, who were poets and historians. We had Druids, who were kind of like a priestly caste. And this is just a few examples of the many different professions that existed in Ireland. One of those castes or classes would be the warrior class. And this would be mostly the free men, of course, who were trained in the use of arms and weaponry from a very young age. What is striking about the Irish system, especially when you look at the mythology, is that war and violence is never too far away from art and literature, in the sense that when we talk of our Nafina warriors from our legends of Fionn McCool, they were poets as much as they were warriors. That in order to be in Nafina and to be considered a noble warrior, you must know the 12 books of poetry. What were those 12 books? We're not too sure anymore, but we can glean evidence from other parts of Irish literature, the law tracts, the mythologies. And when we throw a broad net over these topics, we can kind of piece a picture together of what it might have been like. The other challenge then with doing this sort of research is a lot of our texts are written in an old Irish that not many people speak anymore. So I am reliant mostly on the translation. So I'm trusting the translator with that. And I think that there's just been not so much of a thirst for this knowledge, especially since independence. It strikes me as odd that when we became independent as a country, there was only a few conversations about Brehon Law. Like, they did happen, what we would call our founding fathers, if you want. They did talk about the possibility of bringing Brehon Law back into Irish system, but they kind of felt that, well, we've been using this English system now for too long, that it would be very difficult for us to get buy-in from the people, and they didn't have enough knowledge really on how would we do courts differently, because we had lost a lot of that information. So when it comes to games and festivals, I know you guys are talking about funeral games and the Teletown Games. Now, the funeral games was a very common custom in Ireland, and it still remains today in the form of a wake. But particularly in the pre-Christian era, before the church was very strong on the island, there was a lot more to the funeral games than that. You had tests of physical prowess. So people who were attending the funeral would challenge each other to a long jump and a high jump, or maybe a hurling match, or maybe see who can throw the spear the farthest, and maybe a boxing fight or something like that. But you could also have games of strategy, maybe for the older gentlemen and women. they're not going to be doing physical acts, not going to be wrestling or swimming, but they might sit down and play a strategy game, or they might play what was called fidgel, which was we call it chess. It's probably a bit different than chess, but a similar concept, a board game like that. But as I said, you can't really divorce Irish culture from the arts and the literature. So there was absolutely an artistic aspect to pretty much everything the Irish did when they gathered. And this took the form mostly of poetry and storytelling. Also singing songs, dancing, the Shannos dancing. This would be very part of our culture, and you would find it wherever Irish people gather. Another common thing, especially at the festivals, so if we're moving away from the smaller wake of a funeral, it was an opportunity for the traveling craftsmen around the island, or the craftsmen of Munster and the craftsmen of Ulster, to come to Tara, for example, for the great festival at Tara, and actually show off their local crafts. This was also a way that they could learn new techniques, new patterns. How are they doing it up in Ulster, and how can we do it better? The Munster man might say. So this is all kind of a typical Irish traditions in the funeral and the wake. When we talk of the Telton Games, these were supposedly instituted by the god Lula Father Samuel Donach, who we learn in the legends defeated the Fomorians at the Battle of Cap Torah. And his foster mother was a goddess of sovereignty and fertility and harvest and the land, and her name was Teltu. So when she died, he instituted the Telton Games, which were the funeral games for Telton. But because she was a goddess, obviously these games became much more prestigious. They were annual. People looked forward to them. It's where we get the Festival of Lunasa, also named after Lula Fada, Samuel Donach. It comes from that same word. And so what we would expect to see at these games is pretty much what I was talking about a moment ago, but in a much more ordered way and in a much more competitive way. So I think that's a good little teaser for this topic.
I'm interested about all of these different sort of games and sports that the people were playing, even sort of the chess-like games and sort of the games of strategy. So, I mean, where you have a lot of these skills stated on your website, and whereabouts where people go to look for these? I mean, even the likes of the was it spear throwing was massive because of Lou and his his affinity with the spear, sort of Lou of the long arm. I mean, I think the original spear probably would have been like a stone head, sort of that it was a shaped stone. Whereas sort of more later days it probably would have moved on to being a metal tipped. But so tell us more about the all of the different sort of tools that they were using for their sports.
Yeah, great question. There is a lot of stuff on the site about it, and I have many different blog posts, and so if people search for like Nafina or Telton Games, they'll find a few of them. But the spear is a great question. The spear of Lula Fada Samildonach was called the Gay Bulga. And this appears later on in the mythology. If I'm correct, I'm a bit rusty on this, Josie, but if I'm correct, it appears later in the stories of Cuchulainn. This is the spear that never misses its mark once it's thrown. And from what I can gather, there was more or less two types of spears that the Irish used. There was like a light spear and a heavy spear. And when it comes to the games, you can imagine it's kind of a javelin throw. Okay, what we see today in the modern Olympics is not a million miles away from what was happening in Ireland. Let me just share this quick quote with you from Thomas Lonergan. He said, "From time immemorial, the sons of Erin have played a most conspicuous part in every branch of athletic sports. When and where did the athletic games originate? In Ireland, almost 2,000 years before the Christian era." So yeah, when we're talking about the spear, it's a great question. There's a famous spear in our mythology that's connected to Lula Fada Samildonach called the Gay Bulga. And this appears in the stories of Cuchulainn later on, when he is fighting single-handedly against the whole men of Ireland. He takes out the Gae Bulga, and it's a spear that once it is thrown, it never misses its mark. So the spear is a very common weapon in Ireland. The Irish were very familiar with the spear. And as far as I can see, there was generally two types of spear. There was a light one that you would have maybe a few of those in your chariot. And you would have a heavy spear as well. Now, one interesting thing from the Brehon Law, for a warrior to determine the boundary of his home was determined by how far he could throw the spear from his front of his door. And that makes perfect sense, right? Because if he can hit you with the spear, it means you're trespassing. So there was many things in the Brehon Law like this. But just because you mentioned the spear, that one came to mind. Now, if you were a warrior of a higher grade, a higher status, you might get 2 throws of that spear to determine what the perimeter of your land was. So you can extrapolate that to the games then. The show of prowess, the show of strength could be measured by how far you threw the spear, and that's observable, it's easy to see. And so the javelin contest that we see in the modern Olympics would be very similar to the type of throwing contest that they had in Ireland. And not just spears, but also rocks and stones would have been thrown as well. Anything that they could put a bet on, I'd say they were doing. But there was another point I wanted to share with you. This is a quote from Thomas Flanagan, and he's talking about the Tailteann Games. And he says, "From time immemorial, the sons of Éireann have played a most conspicuous part in every branch of athletic sports." When and where did athletic games originate? In Ireland, almost 2,000 years before the Christian era. The annals of the Four Masters tell us that the Tailteann Games were instituted in ancient Ireland at a place now known as Tailteann, and that's in County Meath. And those games developed mighty heroes, the greatest of whom was Cuchulainn, who had been aptly called the Hercules of Hibernia. So our legends and mythology tell us that, yes, even our great hero Cuchulainn was also a participant in these games of Tailteann. Whether he used the Gae Bulga in that contest or not, we can't be sure. It's never been said. But really, it's just would have been contests of physical prowess and ability. Somebody once said to me, and I don't know if it's true, I've never been able to read, I never read about it in a book, but someone said to me, the standing stones, they would have used them as an they would have jumped from stone to stone. That would have been another possible game that they played. Now, I highly encourage you guys not to be jumping on the standing stones, but it's interesting to think about. And that's one of the fun things about, or the rewarding things about the study of Irish history, is that we're allowed to speculate a little bit, because so much has been lost over the years that, you know, we have to make an effort to try and fill in those gaps. And hopefully we can do that with reason, and hopefully we can do that with reference to other written pieces, the legends, and the manuscripts that exist.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. Absolutely no jumping on standing stones, please. But interestingly, there's a resurgence of people doing stone testing in Ireland at the moment now, Kevin. So where they're going out to where there are stones that were specifically for the test, and they're hugely heavy, and sort of all of these weightlifters, and to go and test themselves against the stone. There's actually a channel of a guy, and he just travels around Ireland to go and find these stones and go and test himself with them. I think he's maybe had to do them maybe 2 or 3 different times and go back, and because they're not particularly easy at all to lift. But
Yes.
but again, it's a sort of a resurgence of older skills. So but yeah, absolutely, that's going to be involved too. So was it we also mentioned there that we also have the FANA tests.
So yeah, the Nefina is another interesting part of our history. They would have come a little bit later than Cuchulainn. We call the Cuchulainn cycle the Ulster cycle, for example, but we call the stories of Fionn McCool and his Fina the Fenian cycle of Irish mythology. And just a little context on those people. They're mythological, yeah, but we have reasons, very good reason, to believe that this was actually something that happened in Ireland many hundreds of years ago, that you had these kind of standing militia called the Fina. And where does that name come from? Well, Fina is the word for a warrior, right? We call it a Fien or a Fenian is a warrior. So they were organized into about 300 warriors in each caha. That was what we would call a battalion. The Irish word for a battle is cahach, and these were called a caha, with about 3,000 men in it during peacetime. But apparently they could rally 9,000 men in times of war. And the idea behind the Fina, I'm going to use a very cheeky shortcut here just to help the listeners if they've not heard of this before. But this idea of the samurai comes into play here a little bit for me. They were warriors who had a noble and elite code. They were a guild. And it was very interesting legally what happened when you joined the Fina, because they became your family. You basically left your kin group when you joined the Fina and you became part of that guild, and all of your property and so on would not be going to your family anymore. It would be part of the Fina. And their role was to protect the Gaelic order and support the High King. Gosh, wouldn't it be great if we had them now, huh? And if you wanted to join it, it wasn't easy, okay? It was an arduous and I would say transformative initiation process. Like I said, first thing they had to do was divorce themselves from their family and their tribe, becoming kinless, a man without a kin. And then you would have to seek out the Fina and undertake their trials. Part of this would be that they would assess your moral code and your intellect before they even ask you to do anything physical. Are you a man of honor? And do you know the poems of our people? Do you know the stories of our people? Do you know the history of our people? So very wrapped into this, then we have an idea of a Gaelic warrior code. In terms of the intellect, they would have had to master many books of poetry. They would have been tested on their poetry, their not just the knowledge of the poem, but their correct pronunciation of the Irish, putting the stresses in the right place, the assonants in the right place. And once they were able to show that they had moral standing, they were honorable, and that they were intelligent enough to know the poems and the histories, then they might be allowed to do the physical tests. Now, the physical tests, coming back to the spears, one of those physical tests was dodging spears. So you're in a hole. I'll get into a bit more detail on these challenges in a minute, but basically you would have 5 or 6 people throwing spears at you, and you had to dodge them. Another one would be evading pursuers. So you'd have to run through the forest and you'd be getting chased. You'd have to jump over a branch of a certain height. You'd have to remove a thorn from your foot without slowing down, and you'd have to duck under a branch at the height of your knee. And once they had proven their physical strength, their physical prowess, now they are worthy to be part of the Fina. They accepted the 4 Gesa of Fenian chivalry. And a Gesa is an interesting concept that I haven't seen in other mythologies or other histories. It's kind of like a pledge or a bond or an obligation that's placed on people, knights, the Nefina, as part of their chivalric code. For example, Cuchulainn had a Gesa never to kill birds. We don't know why, but that was one of his Gesa. And in order to show his nobility, he would not kill birds. He would be kind to birds. Some of these 4 Gesa included marrying, but without accepting a dowry, being gentle with women, sharing your possessions, and standing against overwhelming odds in a battle. So we had their intellect, their moral standing, and then their physical prowess. To go a little bit deeper into those physical challenges, it wasn't just that you had to dodge a spear. You had to dodge a spear while you were stood in a knee-deep trench, dug into the ground, and armed only with a shield and a staff of hazelwood. So you weren't completely unarmed. You did have a little stick and you had a little shield, but you were buried in the ground up to your knee in a trench. And the candidate must avoid being hit by the spears of, I said 6, it was 9 warriors being cast at him simultaneously from a distance of 9 ridges away. That's quite specific. Then when he was doing the sprinting test, he was given a head start of how much, do you think? Not 5 minutes, not 10 minutes, of 1 tree. He was given a head start of 1 tree away. And after that, he must evade a team of pursuers through a thick forest, not like the scanty forest that we have today. Unfortunately, Ireland was once lush with beautiful ancient forests before Cromwell came. And he has to escape through this forest unharmed. And during that chase, he must not, he must be so quick and agile that not a single braid of his hair comes loose by hanging branches, and so light-footed that he breaks no withered branches under his foot. The next test was ducking and jumping, and this was a relation to trees again. He has to duck under branches that are the same height as his knee, and he had to jump over, bound over branches that are the same height as his head. Now, I don't think he's jumping from the ground here over a branch that's the height of his head. I think this is like a chin up, a pull up. You have to pull yourself up onto the tree, get up onto that branch, starting from the ground, and it's the height of your head. Then running at full speed, he had to remove a thorn from his foot without slowing. I mentioned that a moment ago. And then he had to single-handedly face a great number of men who were from the Fianna. So these were accomplished men. They knew what they were doing. They were good fighters. But he had to face them with no trembling of his weapon. Doesn't even say he had to beat them. Doesn't even say he had to beat them. He had to face them with no trembling of his weapon, no fear. And then he would be honored to accept the forgassa of Fenian chivalry. He must marry his wife without taking a portion, which means he's not marrying a woman based on how much money she has or her dowry, but instead he should choose his wife based on her manners and her virtues. And he shall be gentle with all women, chivalrous we would call, with all women. Never reserve to himself anything which another person stands in need of. A good Fianna warrior would take the cloak off his own back and give it to a needy person. That was the requirement, the expected requirement, the moral standards of Na Fianna. And finally, he had to stand against all odds up to 9-1. So there was a limit. If it was 10-1, you could run, but if it was 9-1, you had to stay and fight. And that's the ins and outs of Na Fianna and their challenges that they had to go through.
Wow, I'm going to have to do some training. So,
yeah, I'm glad I'm not competing in your games. Like they're going to have the
but
work cut out
anyway.
for them.
So tell me now, what were the 7 grades of wisdom and the virtues of Na Fianna?
Okay, so virtues of the Fianna, what we were just kind of talking about with the Gassa, and if you want to go deeper into this, I didn't look into this before I came onto the call, but I do have a video on YouTube, and there's an article on my site called Fionn McCool's Advice to a Warrior. And if you go through that, there's just a list of things that he's suggesting that you should do. For example, don't be haughty in the alehouse, don't raise your voice to anger. Really basic stuff when you think about it. So there was a certain moral code that they had to follow. When we're talking about the 7 grades of wisdom, we're kind of taking a step away from the Fianna here and more into the social structure of society. Fianna is legends and poems. That's great. But the 7 grades of wisdom are what we know about that from more like the legal manuscripts, which means that this is something that they did in Ireland. It wasn't their legends or their beliefs. This is how society was ordered. And I think this is interesting in relation to the games and in relation to establishing your status, establishing your prestige within the society. Because as I said at the beginning, what's interesting about early Irish society is that every profession was labeled, and within that profession, there was several grades of progress or several grades of experience or status, right? So you have apprentice to master, and within that there was 7 steps. And the most information I was able to find on this was in relation to the Fili, the poet historians, the keepers of Irish wisdom and knowledge. And this is how they were educated. And what it says, what I've read in the manuscripts about this, is that the way it worked in the secular schools, such as of the poets, was similarly how it worked in the ecclesiastical schools. So going through the church education, you would have gone through 7 grades of wisdom as well. And this ties into the games in a very important way, which I'll get to now in a moment. But first, what I'll do is I'll just explain a little bit about these 7 grades, what they were, okay? So in Irish, we call it Seachnaird Éachna, which translates as the 7 grades, Nrád of wisdom. And they represent the stages of progression in education. Now, what's interesting about this, in our time today, the year of education that you're in is based on your age, right? But back then, it wasn't based on your age. It was based on your experience. It was based on your expertise. And that was something that you were able to demonstrate. You were required to demonstrate that expertise in order to be considered graduated to the next grade. So this whole approach to education in Ireland emphasized wisdom as a value. Wisdom is a fundamental value in our society, and wisdom was valued very highly. I know you asked about the clothing, so I'll just do a little tangent here and maybe we can come back to it. But there was a king, I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, but he instituted a rule about the wearing of clothing in Ireland, and that the lower class was allowed to wear one color on their clothes. And then as you went up through the classes, you could add another color and another color. What was interesting is it wasn't the warriors. I can't remember how many. Let's say there's 7, just for argument's sake. The king and his royal family were able to have 7 different colors in their clothes. But the step below that was not warriors. It was the learned people. It was the professors. It was the poets. It was the people of the society who were wise, were second only to the kings and their families. And then the warriors came after that. And that's a very interesting just insight to Irish culture and history that might be different than the continental systems, where the warriors protected the king and basically gave the king his power. So that's just something that comes out again and again as a trend in Irish culture and history, is the love of knowledge and wisdom as a value. Hence, we were called Insular Sanctorum et Doctorum, the island of saints and scholars. It comes from this kind of seed idea. So first, you would become, you do 1 year of elementary
just
school.
On that, yeah, can I just interject there slightly? Just on that, I mean, one of the things that that came up in around that time period is whenever there was like a takeover, I mean, like what happened over in England was whenever there was a takeover from another culture, like the Romans, they would attack the Fili, and they would assassinate and basically all of the Druids, because they held all of the knowledge. Whenever there wasn't books for sort of the ancestral lines and the history and all of that kind of stuff, that literally they held all of the knowledge. So that's whenever they took out the Druids and the Fili, is they were taking out sort of basically the tree of knowledge for the whole entire community.
Absolutely, a great point. Thanks for sharing with that. And it's kind of one of the drawbacks of the oral tradition. I've heard legends about their tongues being cut out as well, you know, so they just couldn't teach it and pass it on. And that's probably what started to drain the well, so to speak, of our ancient wisdom and our wisdom that was held by certain classes of our society that related directly to our families. What did our families do? How did they interact with each other? And I mentioned the Annals of the Four Masters in that quote. That's a great tome of information that has come down to us. Like, despite so much being lost, we're still really lucky that we have enough to piece this together. because we were like occupied for a very long time, and brutally so. The fact that we still have this is great, right? And yes, a lot has been lost, but what we have allows us to make kind of a patchwork quilt. And coming back to, I thought about this when you mentioned the guy lifting the stone, and I didn't want to interrupt you, but I think that this is a bit of a leap, but I think that a lot of this is in us still. It's in us. And there's something in that man that makes him want to go and lift up that stone and test his strength. And that makes sense that people were doing that a long time ago. It just feels right, doesn't it? So these sorts of conversations and the events that you're creating, I think, are invitations to trigger those genetic memories in us. One of the things I've heard many people say about the Brehon Academy and the Brehon Law is, oh my God, I never heard this before, but it feels so familiar. I feel like I'm a homecoming when I come across. I feel nostalgic when I hear this information that I've never heard of before. And I say to them, that's because it's in your blood, my friend. It's in your blood. So to come back to the 7 grades, the you would have an elementary 1 year of education, and I think that was probably for everybody, or mostly the guys, mostly the men, but women could be educated too. And that was like a basic education that everybody kind of had. But then when you wanted to go through the 7 grades of wisdom, you would become a folklach, which means a word maker. Macfermage means a son of composition. A dos, which was a young bush or a tree. So we have this idea of a tree growing with wisdom here. A cano, which is given to us as a wolf cub or a whelp, small dog. And clee, which was a pillar. Then you entered into the higher education, which was composed of 2 grades, the onru, which means the noble stream, and that was lasted for 3 years. And then finally, if you made it this far, you would go to the stream of becoming an olive, which would last for a further 3 years. Now, when it comes to what they're supposed to know for each grade, unfortunately, a lot of the actual text and poems and things that they were learning, we don't have anymore. We have like references to the legends, and we do have some poetry, but we don't know exactly what they were learning in this education. What I've researched, they refer to it as they had to, in year 1, for example, they had to learn 50 oghams. And that's described in the book that I read about it as alphabets of learning. So I think that the 50 oghams are like 50 mnemonic devices. They were alphabets that would help the memory and help the student to learn knowledge about poetry. They also had to learn elementary grammar of Irish and 20 tales. Okay, that's just year 1. And as we go through, if you want me to go into each year, I can into more detail. For your listeners, if you YouTube the 7 grades of wisdom, you'll find I've done it's about 10 minutes video going deep into all of this. But each year they had to learn more. So in the second year, they're learning another 50 oghams. They have 6 lessons in natural philosophy, and they're learning 6 dians, which is Irish word for poetic meter. They had to learn another 20 to 30 tales. They had to learn introductory poems. That's just year 2. And as we go on and on, we're adding to that each time, another 50 oghams, another lessons in philosophy. In year 3, they learned what's called diphthongal combinations. And that's where 2 vowels are pronounced as a single sound. So like the word height has a diphthongal combination in it, the E and the I. And they were learning this as an actual skill, because it's not just the words you say, it's how you say the words, right? So they were learning about the assonance and how to put the emphasis on certain parts of their poems. They had to learn another 40 tales. They had to learn more poems. And this is only till year 4, then they started to learn what we call the Brehon Law. And the Brehon Law were the laws of the Nemeds, the nobles. Nemed, it shares the same root word with Nave, like Nave is in spirit or sacred, right? And these were the laws of the privileged classes. So at this point, they're starting to dip their toe into the higher society, because you could only really be part of that society if you understood the laws of the privileged. How does that society work? They had to learn another 20 poems before going into year 5 with 60 more tales. And I'm just adding and adding on to this, right? As you can see, each year, in year 6, they had another 40 poems called Nua, which means twins. They had to learn the secret language of the Philly, which we don't know what it is. It is just the secret language of the Philly. They spoke a special language called the Barle Finny, which was another kind of archaic form of Irish, a little bit like the way they speak legalese in court, right? It's English, but it's a certain type of English that you might not fully understand if you haven't studied it. So it was similar with these professions as well. They had to learn at this point another 70 to 80 tales. In year 7, 8, and 9, this is the Onru, the noble stream is what it means. And this is kind of the advanced poetry education. I'm not going to go through everything that they learned in there, but it was a lot of stuff. It's 3 more years of learning. One of the things they had to learn was the Dinshenkus, which is the poetry of place names. So they had to know the names of places and the origins of the names of places. This shows up in the stories of Cuchulainn, where he has to recite the names of the different hills between, I think, here and not here. I'm imagining that I'm standing on the hill of Tara, between the hill of Tara and now on Macha, and so on. And eventually, from years 10 till 12, if you got that far, you could become an Olav. An Olav is the word that we would use today for professor or a doctor. So it's a PhD, basically. And you could have an Olav Philly, you could have an Olav League, like doctors, poets. Each profession could be mastered to the level of a professor or a doctor, which we called an Olav. And one of the most prestigious positions in Ireland, next to the king, next to the Ardri, was the Ard Olav of the king, Ard Olav Nareed. So that's kind of all of that, right? That's the 7 grades of wisdom. But how did I show you that I knew this stuff? How could I prove? How did I pass to the next grade? That's where the festivals come in. Because one part of these festivals, whether it's on Tara or on Macha and other places where they happen, would be the recitation of poetry. And you're reciting this poetry, you're the student, you want to graduate from one level to the next, you will be tested on those 175 poems that you learned and all the oaths that you learned and your correct pronunciation. So you will be called upon to give a story of Dermot and Grania, for example, right? And you have to be able to recite that perfectly, and you have to be able to add a little bit of sparkle into it as well, add a little bit of flair, a little bit of flourish, right? A little bit of drama, without deviating from the details. Right? They like to be entertained, the Irish. So, and while you're doing this, you're standing, and around you will be all of the older poets, all the older Philly, who will be carefully listening to every word you say, looking for the errors and holding you accountable for them. So that's how I could prove to you and my community that I am an Olav, because I've stood in front of you all and you've challenged me with your questions, and I've been able to show you that I know all of the knowledge of our people, because I've learned all of this in the last 12 years, and sometimes it would last longer.
What was expected of the woman warrior in terms of the games and sort of what she was with the men, sort of sort of on an equal status?
I want to give you as accurate an answer as I can here. I don't want to romanticize it, right? There isn't much said about it, to be honest. Now, there's a few reasons for that, possibly. One of them being that we didn't start writing down anything until after the Christian era. And there seems to be a definite change in women's status over time in Ireland. It seems the further back you go, the more equal and more parity with the husband they were. That's not to say that there wasn't female warriors. It just doesn't seem that there was a lot written about it, especially in relation to the social society. Maybe there's legends about this, and I could tell you a fantastic legend about Queen Macha. But unfortunately, the accomplishments of many of our great women, the Manana Heron, are missing from a lot of these pages. And I'm not sure if even women would have been allowed to compete back then in acts of prowess against the men. They were seen so differently to each other. In the same way that, a woman wasn't considered to be a chieftain, couldn't be a chieftain, couldn't be a high king. And there's more to it than that. It wasn't just like patriarchy, an example of the patriarchy, in the same way that, Virgin Mary has to be a woman, right? The way that their mindset was that the chieftain married the land, and the land was the woman. The land is the goddess. So it makes no sense for a woman. It just wouldn't make sense for them for have a woman to be the high king. Now, we can judge that and we can criticize that today. And I'm not saying that we have to like copy what they're saying at all. But to speak of female warriors, I can give you a little bit of historical insight there. That there was, and I can't remember the era here, but there's a legal manuscript called the Cain Odavan. And Odavan was, I believe, a bishop or like someone high up, a priest in the church or something like that. And during his time, like when Irish people fought, the women would fight also. That's more or less known. That's more or less accepted. The women would fight also. And not in this kind of shield maiden sort of style of fighting, but actually fighting, right? And the story goes that Adavan's mother witnessed two women in a battle ripping their hair out of each other, ripping chunks out of each other, right? Thumping lumps out of each other. And she was so appalled by this, the legend goes that she appealed to her son Adavan to, do something about that, make some law about that. And that's where the Cain Adavan comes from. And in that law, it's basically saying that it's also known as the law of innocence. And it's saying that innocence, so the clergy, he included himself in that, the clergy, children and women should not be injured in battle. And if they were, compensation had to be paid. But to who? The church. It's an interesting part of the history, and maybe we could talk about that another time, or if you want me to go deeper into it, that's totally fine as well. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence that the women...
church, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
The church always wins, doesn't it? So, yeah, that.
Well,
I mean, having said that, what was it? The warrior that taught Cuchulainn was female, and
Scathach.
Because as we go further back, I mean, once I've been sort of looking into the works of sort of Michael Desarian and so forth. So what banners did these guys go in on?
Yeah, and you're breaking up a bit, but I caught your question. You're asking about the clothes and the family unit. But just to address your point, because it's a good point, and I didn't mention Maeve. I should have mentioned Maeve because like she's an amazing warrior queen. And yeah, like I said, the further you go back into the mythology, the more woman is held on a higher status, just as the same as men, right? Specifically in relation to competitions, I haven't read like
flags and what banners did these guys go under.
We have an example of a woman goddess called Macha racing against the horse of a king in the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology. And she beats the king's horse, but she's induced into labor. She gives birth to twins. And that's the legend of where Awan Macha, the palace of up in Ulster, originated from. And there was another Macha, a Queen Macha, and she's probably the only one that I found that you could say actually was a high king of Ireland. And she was a fierce warrior, and she defeated, there was her father and two other kings were sharing the throne in rotation. And when her father died, she claimed inheritance for that. And the two sons of the other kings denied that. So she destroyed them and then pursued them into the forest, disguised herself as a hag, tied up the three men, dragged them back to Tara, where they begged for forgiveness. And her advisors told her to kill them. But she said, no, I won't kill them. They'll work for me, and they're going to build my palace for me. So we definitely have strong women in Irish culture and society when we go back far enough. But to come to then the question about the clothes and the flags and how did we identify each other on the field of battle. I've looked into this a bit. I have a video on YouTube called "The War Cries of Our Ancestors," Irish clans and their war cries. I think it's called battle cries. That's, I think, the most viewed video that I have on YouTube. I think there's over 100,000 views on that one. And despite there being enough information to make a video about it, there isn't a lot of information that says this clan had this particular flag or this particular standard, right? Or these particular colors. Maybe for some of the very well-known families like Brian Boru, there is some description of his standard. What did he carry into battle? But I think the closest thing that we have to this in Ireland today are the heraldic arms for each of the clans. So if people are wondering, what color should I use for my clan? That might be a good place to start and go and look at what colors are used in that. But as for the clothes, specifically, what did they wear? Well, fashion's changed over the time, and it depends on the era. But one of the things that stands out whenever you read about Irish history and this fashions that they had is this what would you call it? Like a cloak that they wore. They called it a brat, and this is the typical picture that you see of an Irish chieftain, and it's like a quilt, and it's wrapped around his body, wrapped over his shoulder. This would be a very distinct item of Irish clothing, so much so that it was written about by the British and the Anglo-Normans, and they described how versatile this piece of clothing was, because it wasn't just something that was stylish, let's say, or something that might tell you their status or what clan they came from. But for example, in the event of a battle, they can wrap this cloak around their arm and use it as a shield, because it would be able to absorb the blow of a sword, right? It would be able to, they'd put their arm up and they take the blow of the sword and it wouldn't cut through. Additionally, it allowed the Irish to basically be nomadic, and they could go into the forest, find a kind of a dry spot, put the blanket over their head and use a rock as a pillow, and they were good to go. So it served a very functional purpose, as well as like some aesthetic purpose to that. So for the colors, it's not easy to know exactly what colors they had. But one interesting thing that your listeners and maybe the people who are going to be attending this event might be interested in looking into is the family slogan. And the word slogan, look it up, comes from Irish. The word slogan is an Irish word. It found its way into the English language. It comes from the word slúgalam. And a slú is like a crowd, and garum is a shout. So it's the shout of a crowd. It's the battle cry of your clan. So when you went onto the battlefield, you would hear Love Darragaboo for the Ulster men. You would hear Cromaboo. You would hear Shandid Abu. And this word Abu, meaning victory, or we say bear billa, grab victory, bear billa. Words like, believe it or not, hullabaloo, hubbub, hurrah, they actually come from that. And the Irish were known for having these family slogans, and they'd go onto the field of battle and use these slogans to rally people together. So much so that I believe it was Henry VIII. I could be getting that wrong the time, but there was an English king who completely banned the shouting of the family slogan on the battlefield. You could only shout, glory to the king, or God save St. George, or whatever the English wanted the Irish people to say. So unfortunately, and I do really mean that, because the more you read about Irish history, the sadder you become, because you really understand how much has been lost. I really, really understand how much has been lost, and it's very rewarding, but it's also quite upsetting when we realize how much has been lost. And I would say one of them is we don't really know what flags they had, but we can imagine that the family heraldry that we have today is the closest thing to that we have.
Look, I've been looking into this lot, especially sort of looking into Mr. Tsarian, and looking again at sort of our flags and thinking, wow, there's a lot that we need to look at with regards to these, like even the whole stuff regarding Akhenaten and so forth. It's just like, okay, well, and sort
Yeah.
of reassess the whole thing. But yeah, but you had some interesting comments there about Brehon Law and about Tara, and it kind of brings me back to you were saying that people sort of feel a great empathy and attachment to the Brehon laws. They're so beautifully scholarly. I mean, there's, that's the only way that you can describe them. They, I mean, somebody had sort of said that some of the judgments by Solomon in Solomon's temple were actually a take on sort of the judgments that were handed down by the Brehons at Tara. And they were referring to Tara as
Yeah.
Solomon's temple.
Yeah.
About about the stealing of a sheep. Would you like to tell us about it?
Did you know that Israelis came to Ireland and put dynamite into the hill of Tara looking for the Ark of the Covenant? That's a fact. In the 60s, I think it was. Because they thought it's Hill of the Torah. Hill of the Tara, Hill of Torah. So there's a lot of stuff there. Even the word like Jew, Jew, we can pronounce it like U, and the U tree is a very sacred tree to the Irish. The connection of the tree of life and the Kabbalah to the idea of the Druidic ideas of the tree of life, the connections between Judaism, Egypt, and art, like it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. But I think that's like a whole other topic. You could spend a long time speculating on that. But to come to the question that you asked me, the story goes that on the hill of Tara, there's a king who had apparently was an unrighteous king. He was an unrighteous king, and his wife had a field of this very expensive crops that they used for dyeing clothes. And there was a woman in the village called Benaid, and Benaid had a sheep, and her sheep escaped one day and got into these crops and eats the crops. Now, in the Brehon Law, we had a very robust set of laws for animal trespass. It happened a lot, believe it or not. Animals escaped, they got into other people's lands, they ate stuff, and you had to pay compensation. So she called on her husband to be the judge, which was completely acceptable because the king was expected to have the judgment of a Brehon, we would say in Ireland, but today we'd say the judgment of Solomon. But back then, the judgment of Brehon is what we would have said. And he gave a judgment that said, well, the queen has suffered a loss, her crops have been damaged, so this woman should give her sheep as payment to the queen for the crops that have been lost. And some people were like, that seems like a fair judgment. That's restitution. That's our value. That's what we want to see. But hearing the judgment, a young boy in the crowd couldn't help himself. Impulsive he was. And he shouted out, that's not the correct judgment. That's a false judgment. The true judgment is this. As the fleece grows on the sheep, so does the fleece grow on the land. So Benaid should give the fleece of the sheep as compensation for the crops that have been eaten. And that is the essence, to me, the beauty of Brehon Law. The beauty of Brehon Law is that they believed that there was a correct judgment that could be found, that was found. They weren't making the law up. And in order to find that judgment, they had to find the principle in nature to support what they were saying. They had to find a principle that was observable in nature. Same as we say to every cow, it's calf. Very famous Irish saying, comes from Brehon Law as well. They would look out at nature and say, that is an observable principle in nature. Let's apply that to this case. Let's apply that to our lives. And that will tell us the correct judgment. And then on top of that, they had to tell the judgment in the form of a poem. I can only imagine, and I'm going to romanticize a bit here, how wonderful it must have been to live in those times where people spoke in poetry to each other and chased after justice. They looked for it, they longed for it, and they knew it when they seen it because they felt it in their hearts. And that is why I set up the Brehon Academy, and that's what I want Irish people to get back again.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Kevin. So, look, Kevin, I'll just, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the Brehon Academy? I know you've opened up a number of your classes sort of free of charge, and you know it's an incredible opportunity for people. So, look, thank you very much. But would you like to sort of tell us more about your work in the Brehon Academy and what's available to people?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to do that. I guess, yeah, when I set this up, it was to fill in those gaps and to try and bring this awareness back a little bit. But like all of this information is out there. I'm not making it up. I've just read about it, and I think part of my mission is to go and read those old dusty books, make sense of them, and then put it in a format that is accessible to today's world, right? And we've had the courses online on there for several years now. I think they've been up since about 2017, something like the first one went up in 2017. And I just of late have been feeling, I want as many people to have access to this information as possible. So I've made them all available for free. There's 4 courses, there's 180 lessons, and it goes through a lot of what we've talked about today, but in maybe more detail and structured step by step. So you start with the culture, you can move on to the mythology, and then go to the Brehon Law. My mission is I really just want to blow on the embers of Irish culture and try and get a little spark going again. So for your listeners and the type of people who will be listening to this, I really invite you guys to come and check out these courses completely free, and they will be free forever from now. They're never going to be for sale again, so you can access them whenever you want. And I guess like one other thing that just popped into my mind when you were asking me that question is, I've been doing this by myself since 2013, and it's a labor of love. It's a passion project, but I don't really often have enough time to put into it that I would like. So I guess I'm putting it out there to the universe, to anybody who might be hearing this. I could use your help as well in just lighting a fire under this, and use the Brehon Academy as a vehicle for sharing your articles, your ideas. And Josie, I'd love to invite you over to the Brehon Academy for an interview to talk about your work. And let's just kind of build a network here and become a vehicle for the knowledge of the ancestors to come through us again.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I think the time is just right for it. I think it's passion within our hearts, sort of this grow. I'm very appreciative of your work and what you've put out there with the Brehon Academy. I know anytime I'm looking for something, I do I do go to your site because it's the definitive. It just sort of puts things nicely in a very easy kind of a way, and it gives me a brief sort of an overview. So thank you so much for your work, Kevin.
Thanks for having me on, Josie. I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you so much, Kevin.